which is the funny thing. We act as if it's technology disruption that brought it about. But we're talking about technologies that became firmly entrenched in many industries 20 years ago. And until 5 years ago, most organizations did almost nothing to reimagine what their business could be or should be for the digital age. They kind of sat on their heels. They defended their status quo. They waited. And 5 years ago, all of a sudden, digital transformation was a board level agenda item. It's like, if you're in retail and you didn't have a viable e-commerce strategy before COVID, shame on you, right?
So, I'm with you here because to me, transformation is not something we're looking to do in our lives, on our jobs, in our countries. Okay, transformations, it doesn't have a lot of positivity in it, don't you think?
No, it's painful, right?
It's painful. Who is looking for more pain? I'm not.
Yeah, right. Nobody is, and everybody puts it off. But the irony is, and I talk about this in my book, Never Normal, is that if the same organizations that started really wrestling with the challenge of transformation a few years ago, or even worse, starting to think about it seriously today in a post-COVID environment, if instead they had read the signals 20 years ago and started making change more gradually in a more manageable way, taking smaller steps, but taking them strategically and repeatedly over the course of 20 years, over time, their organizations would have been wholly transformed without the pain and the suffering and the angst and the expense and the disruption of all of a sudden big, disrupt ourselves, transform the whole company. But so few organizations did that. And that's when I say, digital transformation being a human-made crisis, it's like, because you weren't studying change. You weren't looking for the signals out at the edges and, thinking about what's happening out there before it moves into the mainstream the way someone, it's almost a cliche, but if Jeff Bezos could do it, so could any CEO of any retail company, but they didn't, right? And they sat and they waited and waited and waited. And, when I saw articles, and I don't want to pick on retail specifically, but, when COVID hit and articles started to hit and, started to appear in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal and stuff about how major brick and mortar retailers were sitting on mountains of unsold inventory that they couldn't move because consumers couldn't go to the mall. It's like, how could that possibly be? How could your supply chain be so rigid that the product even ended up in the mall? And how could your strategy be so analog that you couldn't have kind of served customers digitally? And then they all have websites, they all have e-commerce strategies, but I think a lot of organizations kept that sort of year 2000 sense that you can just kind of brush off digital.